Hello. Both the left and alt-right are interested in white racial identity. Alt-right white supremacists and white nationalists connect white racial identity to Western civilization. Through this connection, they describe themselves as defending a set of racially conditioned values. The mainstream academic left is focused on whiteness as a source of racism in opposition to blackness or people of color, inseparable from the American project and infecting Western civilization to its roots. One need look no further than the Atlantic to see this. Ta-Nehisi Coates describes whiteness as an all-explaining bloody inheritance and ancestral talisman wielded by whites against non-whites, whether they know it or not. Additionally, Peter Beinart and James Fallows condemned President Trump's Warsaw speech appeal to the West cultural and religious foundations as religious paranoia and racist. It is tempting to dismiss both the alt-right analysis and leftist criticism as bogus. However, it is true that white nationalism exalts Anglo-Saxon Teutonic identity to a normative ideal, and there is a history to this. I thus have some sympathy for the leftist criticism, but only some. Before we get too deep into the weeds, it is necessary to say something about what leftists are talking about when they talk about whiteness, and how white nationalists wield white identity in connection to their idea of Western civilization. I turn to the University of Calgary's anti-racism webpage, where we are told that the term white people does not refer to skin color, but to whiteness. Whiteness, they say, is a shorthand for the privileges or power that people who appear white receive because they are not subjected to the racism faced by people of color and indigenous people. More specifically, we are told that whiteness is a set of normative privileges granted to white-skinned individuals and groups. It is normalized in its production or maintenance for those of that group such that its operations are invisible to those privileged by it, but not to those oppressed or disadvantaged by it. It has a long history in European imperialism and epistemologies. Whiteness is characterized as a privileged social category in which all white-skinned people participate, often unknowingly, and it even affects how white people conceive of the world and justify their beliefs about it. To see how whiteness is said to operate as a normative ideal active in white epistemologies, consider an example. As shown in my video, Grammar is Racist, University of Washington Tacoma Director of University Writing, Asao Inoue, explains that whiteness is manifest in a set of writing expectations established as standard American English. Discursive expectations set up two ideals. One governs how writing and speech should be structured, and the other governs how the ideal discourse should proceed. Because these ideals arose in the context of white hegemony, they are a product of whiteness. Thus, Inoue claims the privileging of abstract principles, rationality and logic, clarity and consistency in standard English discourse is a form of white supremacy from which students must liberate themselves. This is what the University of Calgary means by whiteness infecting European epistemologies. The idea is that European philosophical and scientific discourse is shot through with white supremacism because it leans on epistemic norms that arose in Europe and that are enforced in European-modeled institutions like universities, all of which is infected by whiteness invisible to those immersed in and privileged by it. Because leftists see whiteness as a highly contingent social construction with no basis in physical reality, they argue that whiteness represents an arbitrary and hierarchical exercise of power against non-white persons and ideals. What falls outside of whiteness falls below it, and this is oppressive. Whiteness is thus identified as the source of social fracture and racial inequality. A personal program of waking up and subsequent purgation is suggested through which whites may find solidarity with non-whites, and a political and educational program of eliminating whiteness is proposed. The idea of whiteness as a normative ideal and source of identity is present in the alt-right as well. For example, the white nationalist website American Renaissance states that race is an important aspect of individual and group identity. Different races build different societies that reflect their natures, and it is entirely normal for whites, or for people of any other race, to want to be the majority race in their own homeland. If whites permit themselves to become a minority population, they will lose their civilization, their heritage, and even their existence as a distinct people. As in the leftist criticism, it is clear that whiteness is being treated as an ideal from which a set of values further defining a particular people flow. Because the alt-right sees race as a real biological category, it is part of the environmental background that shapes culture. Thus, race is connected to culture and personal identity and values. Because most of the West's key figures are white, the West's values and epistemologies are connected to the biologically white, the people of Europe and the European colonial diaspora. Whiteness as a biological category is thus entwined with Western civilization and Western identity. Western identity, then, is white identity. By white nationalist reckoning, racial identity is part of the particular social attachments of shared culture that are necessary for human flourishing. Whereas the left sees whiteness as lived out constantly in day-to-day life, alt-righties may not acknowledge this and so argue with lefties over whether whiteness explains things like socioeconomic outcomes. Still, whiteness is held up as a normative ideal. At this point, two interesting features of white racial identity emerge. First, it is peculiarly portable in a society increasingly cut off from old traditions and associations. And secondly, we should embrace racial identification as a feature of human life and organize interracially homogeneous nations. This, of course, is the alt-right story. White racial identity in the alt-right thus performs the functions of identifying the cause of alienation and cultural malaise, unites deracinated whites around a portable source of association and value, and proposes a political program. Though it may sound surprising at first, whiteness is something both the left and alt-right affirm as a social force. Both associate whiteness with an ideal of the self and a set of normative privileges attached to the idea of biological race. Whereas the left decries this as oppressive, the alt-right embraces it as important to a thriving society. This is why the alt-right is fixated on defending race realism and why leftists want to demolish the idea of biological race. However, the leftist case is on shaky ground here. Philosopher of science Nevan Sesardic points out three ways in which race could be involved in biology: genetically, morphologically, or psychologically. It is often charged against the genetic idea of human races that the members of a given race vary more with each other than across racial lines. After all, interracial genetic difference accounts for only 7% of human genetic variation. However, Sesardic asks us to examine an illustrative chart. On a gene locus by gene locus basis, no reliable genetic racial classification can be made. This is because doing so is like trying to classify the points in the chart along just the x or just the y-axis. On each axis, there is more within-group variation than between-group variation. However, when x and y are taken aggregately, a clear difference emerges as illustrated by the line. Thus, race can be genetically real, even if racial differences account for only a small percentage of total human variation. Secondly, it is sometimes argued that the more morphological traits are used to classify races, the less reliable the classifications become. This claim flies in the face of forensic science. Studies show that forensic anthropologists can sort American whites and blacks with 80% accuracy on the basis of 2 traits, with 95% accuracy on the basis of 7 traits, and with 97% accuracy on the basis of 19 traits. Of real interest here is the possibility of broad psychological differences. There is evidence that cognitive abilities and Big Five personality traits have a large inherited component. Thus, it is not crazy to expect different genetic populations, what we might call races, to exhibit differently shaped bell curves centered on different medians regarding various psychological characteristics. However, finding these would be a far cry from establishing race-based normative ideals. I have not argued for the reality of biological race here. Only that dismissal of the alt-right on the basis of biology faces serious challenges. Or doing so appears to concede the normative significance of biological race, if it exists, to the alt-right anyway. I contend that even if race exists biologically, it is a pseudo-identity and flimsy ideal because whiteness is not an organic identity at all. Distinguishing between one's nation, one's ethne, from which we get the word ethnicity, and others is nothing new and was present across the classical world from China to Greece. For example, Book 5 of Plato's Republic affirms Greek supremacy when the characters argue that Greeks should not enslave other Greeks because they are the same people. However, Greek is not used here as a racial term. Greek identity had more to do with familial affiliation or espoused culture than with what we would think of today as racial categories. Where classical Greek writers espouse Greek superiority, they are espousing ethno-chauvinism, not racism. Similarly, race itself is a relatively recent term in English and early on referred to a people, an organic identity arising from shared association, history, and culture, and that people's unique character. Things begin to change in the 17th century. I will focus on developments in the Americas. Many immigrants to the Americas were indentured servants, poor people of Great Britain who had traded their labor for passage to the New World and housing once they arrived. Like slaves imported from Africa, indentured servants were considered personal property throughout the period of indenture and were even inheritable. Moreover, most early laws concerning servitude were concerned with indentured servants. During the middle of the 17th century, things changed. The law began to draw distinctions between indentured servants who were predominantly white and slaves who were predominantly black. Though the case may have been directed at fornication in general, race comes up in sexual matters in 1630 when one Hugh Davis of the Virginia colony is to be soundly whipped before an assembly of Negroes and others for abusing himself to the dishonor of God and shame of Christianity by defiling his body and lying with a Negro. However, it is not until 1691 that Virginia becomes the first colony to pass an anti-miscegenation law describing racial marriage as an abominable mixture, which threatens to increase in this dominion. Thus, English and other white women and men were forbidden to marry any Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman on pain of exile. It is worth thinking about what was going on in Virginia during this time. Of special note is Bacon's Rebellion of 1676. Bacon, cousin by marriage to Governor Barclay, was angered at Barclay's refusal to appoint him general of the militia, an office Bacon intended to use to make war on the natives whom he and his followers saw as enemies. The specifics of the events are too convoluted to rehash here, but suffice it to say that each leader offered freedom to slaves and indentured servants who would join their cause. Bacon's cause gathered much more popular support, resulting in the conflagration of Jamestown. Bacon's rebellion appears to illustrate that poor whites and blacks could and did band together for their own perceived collective interest against ruling elites. Perhaps, then, it is not surprising that in 1680, Virginia passed a law prohibiting slaves from gathering even at funerals, arming themselves for any reason, or leaving the plantation without written permission. And unsurprising, too, that the rule of inheriting the condition of one's father was reversed in the case of children born of black women, with mixed-race children born of white indentured women set at a period of 31 years. This is the context of anti-miscegenation laws, and these laws are revealing. Social cohesion theory asserts that intermarriage decreases social distance between groups. Intermarriage is likely to increase intergroup trust and could play a role in merging two populations into a people, as occurred in England between Brythonic Celts, Anglo-Saxons, and Norsemen, or in many nations of South and Central America between Amerindians and Spaniards. Instead of allowing the process of formation into an ethne, a nation, to occur, anti-miscegenation laws enshrine a strict division of the world into white, black, Amerindian, and so on, as though race carves nature at its joints. But it was not nature, but anti-miscegenation laws themselves that were centrally important to the creation of a subaltern class over which a newly minted white identity had dominion. A Marxist would explain how this solidified and expanded the power of an elite class, and given the sequence of events, there is merit to this analysis. There are other threads of race thinking we might trace to the same time period in Europe, but the story here is enough to make the point that whiteness is an artificial identity for the deracinated. The alt-right is correct that peoples historically contained racially similar individuals. However, it overestimates the importance of race to cultural identity. Typically, a person becomes part of a people, a culture, by being born into a family that lives out that culture in its daily life, extending to the town and beyond. The child is shaped by his culture's stories and ideals, and has a natural solidarity with his countrymen, to whom he owes the obligation of a citizen. Immigrants may become part of a people by participating in its traditions and becoming a part of its story. We could think of this as like adoption. In either case, the bonds are organic and deeply affect the person. Whiteness is not like this. It is a form of identification grounded not in tradition and memory, but in an appearance they happen to share with Western thinkers, artists, and statesmen. But shared appearance requires no shared values or traditions. It is not a manner of living or even of intellectual engagement. Instead of the thick bonds of shared values, tradition, and history, white nationalists rely on 23andMe results or the SPF of their sunscreen. For whites, alienated by the constant mobility and change in relationships, the rootlessness characteristic of liquid modernity, whiteness is tempting as a cheap stand-in for the thick associations of the old world. But at that, white nationalism is to being a people what pornography is to sex. Secondly, the alt-right emphasis on biological race is antagonistic to the West's deep roots in Christianity. White supremacists are antagonistic because they repudiate the imago Dei, a hallmark of Christendom itself. By accepting race as the core of their unity, white nationalists enlist religion in the service of whiteness, that is, white racial identity. This is going on when white nationalists instrumentalize religion, usually a Satru or Christianity. I will not speak of the efforts of modern pagan revivalists here. However, when Christianity is adopted as peculiarly expressive of being white or Western, the way the church has understood itself since Jesus welcomed the Canaanite woman and St. Paul went to the Gentiles is repudiated. Though we might say that the West is an expression of Christianity, this is very different from saying that Christianity uniquely expresses the West. The latter undercuts the idea of transcendence that drove the Western tradition and the way its peoples conceived of themselves. It represents a shallow and distorted understanding of both Christianity and Western civilization. Moreover, subjugating transcendence to racial interest, the purification not of the spirit but of biological type looms near. The line between the call for a white state and genocide looks pretty straight on those terms. I said at the beginning that I have sympathy for the leftist criticism of whiteness, but only some. The story of the ascendancy of whiteness does not support the condemnation of the West or of America's founding principles as inherently white supremacist emanations of an all-pervasive eldritch energy. Leftist responses to whiteness are also self-defeating. Leftists often connect America, Western civilization, or an organic understanding of America or the West to whiteness, that is, to white supremacy. If the idea is simply that something is a product of and infected with white supremacy because it is historically associated with majority white peoples, the claim is either cum hoc or question-begging. There has to be something about that history and association that makes the connection. However, if the story of American anti-miscegenation laws and racial slavery disconnects whiteness from biological race by showing that whiteness is historically contingent and recent, then the left's own scorched earth critique of America and the West at large is thrown into question. Think about it. If whiteness arose as described, then whiteness and racism associated with it is not an essential feature of the West. Since a number of America's founding principles arose in response to Old World conflicts, and the West's deep roots in antiquity in which whiteness could not have been a factor, it is not fair to condemn all of those principles as racist products of whiteness. The breezy move from criticizing whiteness to condemning America's founding principles and Western civilization to utter deconstruction may be rhetorically evocative, but it is a non sequitur. Additionally, the left's means of opposing whiteness is the cultivation of racial identities that sprang into existence with whiteness itself, such as blackness, or to manufacture whole new whole new identities, such as the relentlessly asinine people of color. Thus, the left sets up an antagonistic racial identity politics and then complains when deracinated whites tribe up around race and whiteness. Rather than look to what it takes to forge a single people, the social justice left in particular demands that whites renounce whiteness while offering no alternative source of identification and value. These whites might adopt religion, but leftish aggressive secularism has infected and destroyed their churches. This is more significant than one might realize. The turn from metaphysics undermines the possibility of shared, substantial, and coherent values around which real solidarity can be built. Indeed, secular solidarity offers little to bind people beyond tedious slogans about diversity and coexist bumper stickers. Moreover, the soporific promise of endless choice and consumption peddled by globalist elites in certain quarters of both the left and the right offers only anomie, further obliterating any chance at genuine fellowship. If leftist anti-racist criticism is aimed at solidarity, as is often claimed, it is hypocritical and self-defeating. None of this is to say that whiteness does not or has never existed as a cultural force. However, whiteness is not the all-explaining bloody inheritance and eldritch talisman some make it out to be, and addressing it on those terms is foolish. The left criticizes whiteness as a manufactured identity built around a bogus biological idea of race and criticizes the West as expressing whiteness. The alt-right upholds whiteness as integral to the West and as connected to a real biological kind. However, both fail to appreciate the organic connections of shared culture and history that actually forge a people. One result is a left whose criticisms are self-defeating and offer no respite for the rootless. Another result is an alt-right that cannot adequately address the problem of deracination it raises and is corrosive to the traditions that would. Thank you for listening. If you like this video, definitely click like and let me know what you think in the comments.